Croissant dough can totally be made by hand with some caveats. In a professional bakery, they'd be using a dough sheeter. Now, a dough sheeter runs a dough or a butter block back and forth many times to make perfectly flat layers. That's almost impossible at home. But one great thing about croissants, or anything based on croissants, is they taste good almost always. Now, I'm gonna be using a tapered rolling pin. This is not the best pin for rolling to make a consistently flat base, but because it's tapered, essentially only this amount is really touching whatever you're doing, as long as it's flat, but it makes it much easier to roll anything. So I always recommend tapered rolling pins. You know, at home baking versus in a bakery, you can only expect so much, and I think to make it easier is worthwhile. For the croissant dough, I'm gonna be using a double O flour. It's a higher protein Italian flour. It's on the finer side and works great for creating crispy crusts. Into a small saucepan, we're gonna heat up our milk and water mixture. Just to room temperature, this will just make the dough a little bit more pliable initially and easier to work with, as well as jump starting the yeast. You know, a little head start in a recipe like this goes a long way. Though we want to retain most of its activity for the proofing step prior to baking. It's super important to get right and pretty damn easy to screw up. In a large bowl, we'll mix together our dry ingredients, our double O flour. If you use something like bread flour or all-purpose flour in the US, you'll just get a chewier crumb, not necessarily a delicate one that we're after. And some medium coarse salt. And instant yeast. Instant yeast has smaller particles than active dry yeast, aka it absorbs water much more readily and can be added directly to dry ingredients opposed to the bloom cycle, which I'm not sure I actually believe in with the bloom cycle, but that being said, I've read it. Instant yeast can totally be swapped out for active dry yeast or fresh yeast, each of which requires their own special considerations. Thankfully, in the days of the internet, we now can just learn everything, so feel free to go check that out. Into the bowl goes cane sugar, give that a stir to homogenize. Mixing in our butter by hand, just working between your fingertips to create a breadcrumb-like consistency, very similar to pastry making. You can totally do this step after like brioche. Normally it is, but by hand I think it's easier to do before. Next we can make a well in our dough and add our wet ingredients. We've got our warmed milk water mixture. 1 egg. And approximately 20 grams of honey. One fun thing about doing stuff like this by hand is it allows you to really get to know the dough. You're spending time working with it, and you get to see exactly what the gluten structure is looking like as you develop it. Kneading it on the counter for a few minutes, just trying to create a less segregated structure. You can imagine all the ingredients are kind of off in their own little pockets, and as we do this, it kind of helps bring them together and slightly warms the dough, which will help proofing. The goal with a dough like this is just to create a rough ball. It's not gonna be a smooth dough. It's gonna get a lot of stretching as we start sheeting it out and rolling it. So once it rests, it's ready to go. Toss it into a bowl and cover with a wet cloth or something like beeswrap. Let it sit at room temperature for about an hour. Pastry. For a croissant dough, you want to use a butter with a high butter fat content. Most butters fall into the 82% or just slightly below range, but if you can find something about 84%, that's the goal. This Vital Farms pasture-raised butter is 83%. Closest I could find to 84. Interestingly, I found several sites that say that they have 85% on their website, and then when you look on the packaging, it's 83 or 82. I don't know why, but that seems to be a thing. Place your butter inside a 7" by 7" freezer bag, sealing it well. I've tried doing parchment paper plenty of times, but this seems to work better. Really go to town on this initial stage. It'll help roll it out, working it into the corners to create as smooth of a square as you can, picking it up ever so often just to check for thickness. It's really helpful with plastic like this to see it. Go ahead and pop it in the fridge to chill it down while we work on our dough. I've chilled the dough down, 5 minutes in the freezer, 15 minutes in the fridge to try to bring it to the same consistency as my butter. The goal here is to create an even flow between the two, so as close as you can get. Then rolling out your dough to be double the size of your butter block. Whether you have a 7 by 7, 8 by 8, whatever, I think a thicker one helps, but you might have to use what you have on hand. Score the bag gently, try not to cut too deeply into the butter. Then we can go ahead and lift the corners to release and combine the butter block with our dough to create a beautiful union of Viennoiserie and begin the laminating process. This is one where the journey is part of the joy. Get the edges crimped nice and tight, this will keep the butter in. Then gently press to create a wave pattern across the block. Then bring down the crest to create a relatively smooth wavy form. Begin at the middle and start rolling out gently. Try not to apply too much downward pressure. We're really trying to keep these as thin as possible while also not squishing it out. It's easier said than done, and eventually you'll be fighting gluten, but for now, slowly working this out. We're shooting for a 1/4 inch thickness on the first roll. By concentrating more on thickness than dimensions, we can create a much more consistent laminated pastry in the end. Our ultimate goal is to get the finest, thinnest layers possible. If, when rolling, you find yourself the little butter opening up at the seams, go ahead and crimp it off and roll it up. If it still seems cold and not sticky, keep working on your dough. If it is sticky, go ahead and chill it in the freezer for 10 minutes just to set it up a bit and make your life a lot easier. Be aware that with a laminated rolling pin, it's much easier to create a thin spot in the middle of your laminated pastries, so rolling on the edges while checking thickness is a great way to help ensure as consistent a thickness as possible. When people do this with a dough sheeter by machine, it rolls it through a set thickness, and that's the thickness it is. But at home, this is artisan, this is craft, it's gonna be a little bit wonky here and there. Once you're happy, go ahead and mark the middle lightly, and now we're going to create the book fold, also known as the double turn. Gently bring in the outer edges to the middle, then slowly working, try to square them up as best as possible before actually making the fold. This will take our 3 layers of dough, butter, dough, and make it into 12. Gently pressing on the edges, which are now a little bit higher since you folded them over each other to make as uniform a block as possible, squaring it off, making it pretty, before we wrap it up and chill it down in the fridge for, let's say, 10 to 20 minutes. We're just trying to let some of that gluten slack off before we go to the next rolling stage. As the dough gets more developed, the gluten gets tougher and tougher to deal with as it gets longer and longer and needs to rest so it can relax a bit and make it so you don't ruin your wrists trying to do this, or your shoulders, or your back. Once chilled, we can re-roll it out to a 1/2 inch thick, and now we're going to perform the letter fold, also known as the single turn. Again, getting a nice squared block before we do our final chill for 30 minutes, and then our final roll, where we're aiming for an 1/8 inch thick or at least 14 inches wide to create nice croissant dough. Once I've attained 35 centimeters or 14 inches wide, then we can start cutting out our croissants. First, cut the ends off to square it up. With the dough rolled out to 21 inches wide, mark it off at 3-inch intervals. This will give us 7 sections that we'll then have to make 14 croissants total. If when you're cutting these out, your dough bounces back a little bit, don't worry. Sometimes it's hard to get this rested as much as you'd like. Now, using a chef's knife or a bicycle cutter, section them off. Create nice diagonals, making sure you cut all the way down to the table so you get a nice clean edge on your croissants. Then create a little cut, maybe a 1/2 inch thick at the base of each one. This will help when rolling them out to establish a thicker base. When rolling up a croissant, I like to do it away from me. Lots of people do it towards themselves, but it just feels weird. And you know, sometimes you just gotta stick with what feels right. Once they're rolled up, give the tip a little tap to settle it into the base, helping them not fall over and be a little flatter on the bottoms. Onto a lined sheet pan, we can place our croissants stagger style to allow for growth during the final rise. With the croissants about 1.5 inches tall approximately, we'll be looking for 3 inches total after the final rise. All right, delicately putting that in is the key. Another thing I'm using that's really important is a temperature probe. So water just off the boil, placed under a sheet pan, can actually heat it up too much, especially if it's close to it, even remotely. So what I've done is I've put it above it, being really careful not to spill any down, and kind of in the back of the oven. So it's gonna do 2 things. It's gonna heat up the oven, hopefully at a controlled temperature. You might need to open your oven now and again to let out some heat, just keeping an eye on the actual temperature probe. Basically 80 to 82 degrees is ideal. Once you start crossing that 82 degree threshold, butter can melt. And you'll see that pretty quickly when it comes out onto the sheet tray. Been there plenty of times. Initially, you'll have a rise in your oven for about 30 minutes, need to open the door to cool it down, and then after about an hour, it seems to stabilize. You might need to revitalize your water, but once it's between 126 Fahrenheit and 110 Fahrenheit, it seems to hold. I'm using an egg wash of egg yolk mixed with cream. This allows for a deeper brown color with a little less shine, and to lower protein content with a lack of egg white, it also allows the layers to spill out a bit more and not get held together. Normally when painting these, you're trying not to touch the layers because you don't want it to adhere together with the egg, but I think using an egg yolk cream really helps to resolve this issue, and they turn out great in the end. Well, a couple of them didn't make it to perfection. This one, for instance, kind of slid on its side. Maybe it was a little high in the oven and not wide enough, or maybe it just got a little warm, or the structure wasn't perfect. This one also laminated off this crisp layer that was probably too thin, and or egg wash got under it or something. But overall, pretty good lamination. You know, 6 batches in to get somewhere like this. During my croissant making days, making thousands and thousands of croissants, I was probably only happy like 5 times. I mean, it's such, I want to say chase the dragon, but I know that's for opium. Not that, not that. Chasing something, maybe the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, whatever. Chasing perfection. Making croissants, there's so many variables. It's advanced baking. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, and you know, even professionals screw up from time to time. In professional kitchens, I mean, not here. Pretty good crumb structure, almost entirely open. That can be really challenging at home, is to get your proofing all the way to the end. Sometimes it doesn't want to. That's also something that can happen. Through nice, neat corners can be attained by squishing it out with a rolling pin.